Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we are undertaking, well, a massive mission. We're peering inside the cell's ultimate master control panel.
We really are.
We're talking about gene expression and how does life manage to read the exact same DNA blueprint in every single cell, yet still build a nerve cell, a liver cell, or a bacterial cell that has to adapt instantly?
It's the regulatory symphony that governs life. If you think of DNA as this huge library of blueprints, gene regulation is the project manager, the security guard, and the CEO all rolled into one.
All at once.
Exactly. It dictates not just what proteins are made, but when, where, and critically how much. Our mission today is to tackle this entire control system from the simple logic of bacteria all the way up to us.
It's the difference between having the instructions for a skyscraper and actually having the system that decides which materials arrive on which day. If you waste energy, you lose.
Okay, let's unpack this, starting with the simplest and maybe the most brutally efficient system, bacteria. Bacteria, like E. coli, are survival artists. They live in places like our gut, where nutrients are constantly shifting. They just cannot afford to waste energy making enzymes they don't need.
And they have two critical layers of control for this, right? There's a rapid-fire control and then a more long-term strategic one.
That's right. The first one is called feedback inhibition. It's immediate.
How does that work?
Well, imagine the cell is making an amino acid, say tryptophan. If tryptophan suddenly shows up in its environment, the product molecules themselves just go back and block the activity of the very first enzyme in their own synthesis pathway.
So it's an immediate shutdown of the assembly line.
An immediate rapid shutdown. But if that tryptophan sticks around for a while, the cell needs to hit a deeper, slower break.
And that's where we get to the famous Operon model. This is about regulating the actual production of the enzymes.
Exactly. The Operon model was such a breakthrough. It's brilliant in its simplicity. You have a group of related genes, a single promoter to start transcription for all of them, and this one little on-off switch called the operator.
And that structure gives you what's called coordinate control, right? Everything on or everything off at once.
Precisely. All the related enzymes are made or halted simultaneously.
So let's look at the two classic examples. First, the trap operon, which builds tryptophan. It's an anabolic pathway. So since the cell usually needs it, this system is generally on and.
Right, and its structure reflects that. The repressor protein for the trap operon is naturally inactive. It can't bind to the operator on its own.
So what activates it?
Tryptophan itself. When tryptophan is abundant, it acts as a corepressor. It binds to that inactive repressor, changes its shape, and activates it.
And that activated complex then binds the operator and blocks transcription.
The end product literally shuts down its own supply chain.
Then you have the flip side, the lac operon. This is for breaking down lactose. Since lactose isn't always around, this system is normally O off F.
Correct. In this case, the lac repressor protein is innately active. By default, it's sitting on the operator, blocking everything.
So something has to come along and pull it off.
Yes, and that something is allolactose, an isomer of lactose. It acts as the inducer. When lactose is present, allolactose binds to the repressor and inactivates it. It pops off the operator, and boom, the genes for using lactose are transcribed.
Wait, bacteria prefer glucose. So there's another layer here. The cell only wants to use lactose if two conditions are met. Lactose is present, and glucose is scarce.
Exactly. This brings in positive gene regulation, which is like a volume knob, not just on-off. It uses an activator protein called CRP.
And this is tied to glucose levels.
Directly. When glucose is low, a molecule called cyclic AMP, or CAMP, builds up.
So low glucose equals high CMP.
Yep. And CAMP binds to CRP, activating it. This active CRP complex then binds to a site just upstream of the lac promoter.
What does that do?
It dramatically increases RNA polymerase's attraction to the promoter. It's basically a big flashing sign that says, hey, we're low on our main fuel, crank up the lactose enzyme.
So it's a really sophisticated dual control system.
Very sophisticated resource management.
Okay, now we take that elegant, efficient model and we jump straight into eukaryotes. And the complexity just explodes. We're not just talking about survival anymore. We're talking about differential gene expression.
Right. This is the whole basis of multicellular life. How can a nerve cell and a skin cell have the exact same DNA but be completely different?
It's all in the regulation.
And eukaryotes regulate genes at so many more levels than bacteria, starting before transcription even begins. The first major hurdle is chromatin modification.
Just getting access to the DNA in the first place.
Exactly. Think of the genome as a giant library where most of the books are locked away. Genes packed into dense heterochromatin are silent. Only the ones in the looser open euchromatin can even be read.
So how do you unlock the books? How do you loosen that chromatin?
A key way is modifying the histone proteins, the spools the DNA wraps around. Adding acetyl groups, called histone acetylation, neutralizes their positive charge, which makes them grip the negatively charged DNA less tightly.
It loosens things up.
It loosens things right up, making the DNA accessible.
And the opposite happens with another modification, methylation, correct?
Yes, DNA methylation, adding methyl groups to the DNA itself, usually to cytosine, leads to long-term gene silencing. It's a much more permanent off switch.
And this brings us to something really fascinating, epigenetic inheritance. The idea that traits can be passed down without changing the DNA sequence at all.
It's incredible. When a cell divides, the daughter cells inherit these methylation patterns. So if a gene was silenced in the parent cell, it stays silenced. The source material's mouse agouti experiment is a perfect example. Genetically identical mice with different coat colors, just based on the mother's diet affecting methylation in the womb.
Okay, so we've opened the chromatin. The next level of control is actually starting transcription, control of transcription initiation.
Right. All genes need a basic set of general transcription factors, but for high-level, specific expression, you need more. You need specific transcription factors.
And these often bind to DNA sequences called enhancers, which can be really far away from the gene they control.
Incredibly far. Thousands of base pairs away, upstream, downstream, even within an intron.
That seems physically impossible. How does a protein binding way over there affect a promoter way over here?
This is where the cell gets architectural. Activator proteins bind to those distant enhancers. Then, DNA-bending proteins literally fold the entire DNA strand into a loop.
A loop.
A loop that brings the activator, bound way out on the enhancer, right into physical contact with a group of mediator proteins and the general transcription factors at the promoter.
Wow. So it's a huge protein DNA complex that has to assemble just to get things going.
A massive initiation complex. That's what it takes to get RNA polymerase working at a high rate.
So the cell has controlled access and controlled initiation, but it's not done yet. Now we have post-transcriptional mechanisms, and the first one is huge, alternative RNA splicing.
This is a major source of protein diversity. The cell transcribes a gene, introns and exons and all, and then depending on which segments it treats as exons, it can create multiple different mRNAs from that single gene.
One gene, many proteins.
Many different but related proteins. The troponin T gene does this to make different versions for different muscle tissues. It's incredibly efficient.
Okay, and once you have that final mRNA, its lifespan is also a control point, mRNA degradation.
Absolutely. Bacterial mRNA lasts minutes. But the mRNA for hemoglobin in our cells can last for weeks, just churning out protein over and over.
And then there's control at the protein level itself, after it's made.
Right. You have translation control, like when an egg activates a ton of stored mRNAs right after fertilization. And then you have protein processing. Pro-insulin has to be cleaved to become active insulin.
And finally, destruction. The cell has a system to get rid of proteins it doesn't need anymore.
A very specific system. It tags proteins for destruction with a little marker protein called ubiquitin.
Like a molecular tag for the trash.
Exactly. And then these huge protein complexes called proteasomes come along, recognize the ubiquitin tag, and just obliterate the protein.
This brings us to what I think is one of the biggest surprises in genomics. For years, we called most of our DNA junk, but now we know about 75% of it is transcribed into RNA.
Yes, the discovery of non-coding RNAs, ncRNAs, completely changed the game. They are powerful regulators.
Let's start with the small ones. The microtans, miRNAs, and small interfering RNAs, the siRNAs.
They're tiny, maybe 22 nucleotides long, and they form a complex with a protein. Then they go hunting for specific mRNA molecules.
What happens when they find one?
If the miRNA sequence is a perfect match for the mRNA, the complex usually just slices and degrades the mRNA. If it's a partial match, it just sits on it and blocks translation.
And they're estimated to regulate at least half of all human genes. That's staggering.
It is. It shows just how much control was happening that we were completely blind to. siRNAs work similarly, but are often involved in defense against things like viruses.
Then you have the big ones, the large non-coding RNAs, lncRNAs.
These can be hundreds of thousands of nucleotides long. The classic example is XEST. In female mammals, the XESC RNA is transcribed from one X chromosome, and then it literally coats that entire chromosome.
It paints the chromosome.
It paints the chromosome, recruiting proteins that condense it into inactive heterochromatin, silencing it completely. An entire chromosome shut down by one RNA molecule.
All this precise Layered regulation is absolutely critical in development. We go from one cell, a zygote, to a full organism through cell division, cell differentiation, and morphogenesis.
And the initial instructions for this come from two places. First, cytoplasmic determinants. These are maternal molecules that the mother unequally distributes in the egg cytoplasm.
So when that first cell divides, the daughter cells get different stuff, and that starts them down different paths.
It switches on different early gene programs. Then, as cells start to multiply and touch each other, they use inductive signals. One cell sends a signal to its neighbor that changes the neighbor's gene expression.
And this leads to determination, right? The point of no return for a cell's fate.
Yes, determination is the molecular commitment. The cell might not look different yet, but its fate is sealed. Then comes differentiation, when it actually becomes, say, a muscle cell.
And the muscle cell example is so clear. It all comes down to a master regulatory gene called MyoD.
Right, MyoD codes for a transcription factor. When it's turned on, it commits the cell to becoming a muscle cell. It turns on other muscle-specific genes like myosin and actin, and it also turns on itself in a positive feedback loop.
It locks itself in.
It locks in that fate.
Now, if we scale up to the whole body plan or pattern formation, the fruit fly gives us this beautiful example with its body axis.
And it all starts with maternal effect genes. The mother sets up the whole system in the egg before it's even fertilized. The best example is the gene becoid. The mother cells pump becoid mRNA into what will become the anterior or head end of the egg.
So there's a high concentration of this mRNA at one end.
Exactly. After fertilization, that mRNA is translated, and the becoid protein, which is a morphogen, forms a concentration gradient. High at the head, low at the tail.
And that gradient is the instruction.
It literally tells the embryo where its head is. If the mother has a mutated becoid gene, the larva develops with two tails and no head. It's that fundamental.
Which brings us finally to what happens when these incredibly precise regulatory systems go wrong. Cancer. It's a disease of broken gene regulation.
Fundamentally, it's an accumulation of genetic and epigenetic changes that mess up the normal controls on cell division.
And we have two main classes of genes involved here. First, proto-oncogenes.
These are the normal, healthy genes that promote cell growth. When they mutate and become hyperactive, we call them oncogenes.
The stuck accelerator pedal.
That's the perfect analogy. And because they're overactive, they're typically dominant. You only need one bad copy. A proto-oncogene can become an oncogene through a point mutation, gene amplification, or being moved next to a stronger promoter.
And then we have the other side. Tumor suppressor genes. These are the brakes.
Their job is to inhibit cell division, repair DNA, things like that, and to lose their function, you usually need to knock out both copies in a cell. They're recessive.
Let's talk about two of the most famous players, RAS and P53. First, RAS.
RAS is a protein in a cell-stimulating pathway. A mutant RAS protein, found in about 30% of cancers, is stuck in the on position. It's constantly telling the cell to divide, even without any external signal.
The ultimate stuck accelerator.
Yes. And then you have P53, often called the guardian angel of the genome. It's mutated in over half of all human cancers.
Why is this so important?
Because the P53 protein is a transcription factor that senses DNA damage. If it finds damage, it can halt the cell cycle to allow for repairs. If the damage is too bad, it triggers programmed cell death apoptosis.
So it eliminates potentially cancerous cells.
Exactly. Losing P53 is like firing your main security guard. Damaged cells are allowed to just keep dividing.
And this all fits into the multi-step model of cancer. It's not one single mutation.
No, it's an accumulation of hits over time. You need to activate an oncogene like RAS and inactivate several tumor suppressors like APC and P53 to get a fully malignant cancer. That's why cancer risk increases so much with age.
But the silver lining here is that understanding all this genetic detail leads to personalized medicine.
Absolutely. We can now sequence a tumor's genome and see exactly which genes are broken. With breast cancer, we classify tumors based on which receptors they express, like HER2.
And if a tumor overexpresses HER2, you can treat it with a drug like Herceptin, which specifically targets that protein.
Precisely. It allows for treatments that are tailored to the molecular problem, which is far more effective.
So we've traveled from the elegant operons of bacteria through the incredible complexity of eukaryotic chromatin, transcription factors, ncRNAs, all the way to how this regulation shapes an embryo and how its failure leads to cancer.
And what's so wild is that the ncRNAs, these things we once dismissed, are regulating half of our genes. It just shows you how much of the cell's logic is still being discovered.
And here's where it gets really interesting. If non-coding RNAs, like miRNAs, regulate up to half of our protein-coding genes, what other major regulatory components are still hidden in that vast stretch of DNA we once called junk? And what potential new therapeutic targets might they offer against hard-to-treat diseases like triple-negative breast cancer, which lacks those easily targeted receptors?
The more we dive, the more layers we find. It's a vast regulatory landscape still waiting to be charted.
Indeed. Thank you for joining this deep dive into the regulatory landscape of the genome.